In the grand halls of power, where whispers can topple kingdoms and secrets can destroy lives, one man found himself caught between loyalty and truth. When the Queen Consort's eyes turned toward Catherine with suspicion and malice, Thomas knew that speaking up would cost him everything he had worked for. But staying silent would cost him something far more precious: his soul. What happens when a servant must choose between his own survival and protecting the woman who showed him kindness when the world turned its back? This is the story of a man who discovered that true courage isn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to face destruction for what's right. Some battles are fought with swords and shields. Others are fought with words and silence. This is the story of the latter, where every conversation could be a weapon, every glance could be evidence, and every choice could be the difference between life and death for an innocent woman whose only crime was being different from what the court expected. In a world where power corrupts and fear rules, Thomas would learn that sometimes the greatest victory comes not from winning, but from refusing to surrender your humanity when everyone around you has lost theirs. Thomas Whitmore had served in the royal household for 15 years, and in all that time, he had never seen fear quite like what he witnessed in Catherine's eyes that autumn morning. She stood by the tall windows of the East Wing, her hands trembling as she held a letter that had arrived with the dawn mail. The weak sunlight streaming through the glass made her auburn hair glow, but her face was pale as moonlight.
My lady," Thomas said softly, setting down the tea service on the mahogany table. "Is everything well?" Catherine turned toward him, and Thomas saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten.
She had always been kind to him, treating him not as furniture that moved and served, but as a person with thoughts and feelings. In a palace where most nobles looked through servants as if they were invisible, Catherine's humanity had been like water in a desert. "Thomas," she whispered, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone, "I fear I may be in terrible trouble." The letter in her hands was from her brother Edward, who lived in the countryside managing their family's modest estate. Thomas had delivered many such letters over the years, usually filled with news of harvests and local happenings. But this one was different. This one had arrived through secret channels, avoiding the usual palace mail system that everyone knew was monitored by the Queen Consort's spies. "What does Master Edward write?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew. The entire palace had been buzzing with whispers about Catherine's recent behavior. She had been seen spending time alone in the library, reading books that weren't on the approved list for ladies of the court. She had been asking questions about estate management and legal matters that women weren't supposed to understand. Most damning of all, she had been receiving visits from a lawyer named Mr. Harrison, who helped families recover property that had been unfairly taken by the Crown. Catherine sat down heavily in her chair, and Thomas noticed how her hands shook as she folded the letter. "Edward warns me that agents of the Queen Consort have been asking questions in our village. They want to know about Father's will, about the land grants our family received 3 generations ago. About," she stopped, looking up at Thomas with wide eyes. "About whether our family has any claim to properties that might conflict with recent acquisitions by Her Majesty's relatives." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had heard rumors about the Queen Consort's family systematically acquiring valuable lands through questionable legal maneuvers. Properties that had belonged to noble families for generations were suddenly being declared forfeit due to obscure legal technicalities. Families who protested found themselves facing charges of treason or being quietly removed from court. Catherine's family owned a small but strategically located estate that controlled access to several valuable trade routes. "My lady," Thomas said carefully, "perhaps it would be wise to burn this letter." "I already memorized every word," Catherine replied with a bitter smile. "Thomas, Edward says they're not just asking questions. They're examining old property records, looking for any excuse to claim our lands. And there's more." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He believes someone in the palace is feeding them information about my activities here. Someone has told them about my meetings with Mr. Tobin, Harrison." The implications hit Thomas like a physical blow. If the Queen Consort's agents knew about Catherine's attempts to protect her family's property, they would see it as a direct challenge to their authority. They wouldn't just take the lands, they would destroy Catherine to send a message to anyone else who might consider resisting. "What will you do?" Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. "I don't know," Catherine admitted. If I stop trying to protect our family's rights, we lose everything. But if I continue, they'll find a way to charge me with treason. Either way, my family suffers. Thomas had seen this pattern before. The Queen Consort's method was always the same: identify potential threats, isolate them, and then destroy them in ways that appeared legal and justified. Catherine's kindness and intelligence had made her popular among the palace staff and some of the minor nobility. That popularity would be turned into evidence of seditious behavior. Her interest in law and estate management would become proof of treasonous plotting. Her family's legitimate property rights would be twisted into an attack on royal authority. Perhaps, Thomas said slowly, you might consider seeking advice from Lord Hamilton. He has the Queen's ear and might— Lord Hamilton is the Queen Consort's cousin, Catherine interrupted. Thomas, don't you see? There is no safe path here. Anyone I might turn to for help is either connected to Her Majesty or too frightened to risk their own position by helping me. Thomas watched as Catherine stood and walked back to the window. Outside, the palace gardens were alive with the colors of autumn, but the beauty seemed to mock the darkness of their conversation. He had served in this palace long enough to know how power worked, how the innocent were crushed by forces they couldn't see coming. But he had never felt so personally invested in someone's fate. My lady, he said, surprising himself with his boldness, you are not as alone as you believe. Catherine turned, hope flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? Thomas knew he was about to cross a line that servants weren't supposed to cross. But watching Catherine's quiet desperation, remembering all the small kindnesses she had shown him over the years, he found he couldn't stay silent. The palace staff sees everything, he said quietly. We know who comes and goes, who meets with whom, who says what when they think no one is listening. If someone is spying on you, feeding information to the Queen Consort's agents, we might be able to discover who it is. Thomas, you can't, Catherine said, alarm clear in her voice. If you're caught investigating on my behalf, they'll destroy you too. I won't have that on my conscience. But Thomas had already made his decision. My lady, you once told me that every person has a choice about what kind of character they want to have. You said that our actions in difficult moments reveal who we truly are. He straightened his shoulders. I choose to be someone who doesn't stand by and watch good people be destroyed by evil ones. Catherine stared at him for a long moment, tears beginning to form in her eyes. If you do this, there's no going back. Once you take sides against the Queen Consort, you become her enemy forever. Then I suppose I'd better make sure we win, Thomas replied with a grim smile. Over the next few days, Thomas began his careful investigation. He used his access to all areas of the palace to observe and listen. He paid attention to which servants seemed nervous around Catherine, who asked unusual questions about her routine, and who had recently come into unexpected money or favors. The palace's servant network was like a hidden web that connected every corner of the royal household. Maids who cleaned the Queen Consort's chambers knew which letters she received. Kitchen staff who prepared meals for different nobles could track who was dining with whom. Guards who stood outside important meetings often heard more than they were supposed to. Thomas had friends throughout this network, people who trusted him and who had their own reasons to dislike the Queen Consort's harsh rule. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The spy wasn't just any servant. It was Marcus Fletcher, Catherine's own personal secretary, a man who had worked for her family for over 8 years. Marcus had access to all of Catherine's correspondence, knew about every meeting she attended, and was aware of her family's property concerns because he had helped her research legal precedents. But the betrayal went deeper than simple financial motivation. Through careful questioning of different servants, Thomas learned that Marcus had been promised a position as estate manager for one of the Queen Consort's relatives, along with a generous pension and a house in a desirable district. In exchange, he was providing detailed reports about Catherine's activities and helping to build a case that could be used against her. The most damning discovery was that Marcus had been copying Catherine's private letters before delivering them, including sensitive correspondence with her brother Edward and the lawyer, Mr. Harrison. The Queen Consort's agents knew about Catherine's legal research because Marcus was providing them with copies of every document she reviewed. Thomas felt sick as he realized how completely Catherine had been betrayed by someone she trusted. But he also felt a cold anger that gave him clarity about what had to be done. Marcus Fletcher had to be stopped, but it had to be done in a way that wouldn't immediately alert the Queen Consort that her spy network had been compromised. The next evening, Thomas requested a private moment with Catherine in her study. She looked exhausted, the stress of the past weeks evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands never seemed to stop trembling. "I have news," he said simply. "But you're not going to like it." Catherine steeled herself and nodded for him to continue. "Your secretary, Marcus Fletcher, is the spy. He's been copying your correspondence and reporting your activities to the Queen Consort's agents. They know about your brother's warnings, your meetings with Mr. Harrison, and your research into property law." The color drained from Catherine's face completely. She gripped the edge of her desk so hard her knuckles went white. "Marcus? But he's been with my family for years. He helped teach me to read legal documents. She stopped, understanding dawning in her eyes. "He would know exactly what information would be most damaging." "Yes," Thomas said quietly, "and they've promised him a comfortable position in exchange for building a case against you." "My lady, they're not just gathering information for future use. They're preparing to move against you soon, possibly within the next few weeks." Catherine sank into her chair, the weight of betrayal and danger crushing down on her. For several minutes she just stared at the papers on her desk, papers that Marcus had organized and reviewed, papers that had been turned into weapons against her. Finally, she looked up at Thomas. "What do you think we should do?" Thomas had been thinking about this since confirming Marcus's treachery. "We need to feed him false information while secretly preparing your real defense. Let him think you're planning one thing while you actually do something completely different. And we need to find a way to document his betrayal so thoroughly that if this comes to a formal accusation, you can prove that the evidence against you was manufactured." "That's incredibly dangerous," Catherine said. "If the Queen Consort realizes we know about Marcus, she might move against us immediately rather than waiting for her careful plan to unfold." "It's dangerous," Thomas agreed, "but doing nothing guarantees you'll be destroyed. At least this way we have a chance to fight back." Catherine was quiet for a long time, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Finally, she squared her shoulders and looked directly at Thomas. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smarter and more careful than they are. One mistake will doom us both." Thomas nodded. "Then we won't make any mistakes." But even as he said the words, Thomas knew that they were about to enter a game where the stakes were life and death, where their enemies had all the power, and where one small error could lead to destruction for everyone he cared about. The Queen Consort had crushed others who had tried to resist her. She had resources, connections, and legal authority on her side. All Thomas and Catherine had was their determination to protect what was right, and their willingness to risk everything for truth. In the grand scheme of royal politics, it didn't seem like much. But sometimes, Thomas thought, the smallest lights shine brightest in the darkest places. The real battle was about to begin. The plan Thomas and Catherine devised was intricate and dangerous, like walking across thin ice while pretending to be on solid ground. They would have to maintain the appearance that nothing had changed, while secretly working to expose Marcus Fletcher's betrayal and protect Catherine from the Queen Consort's advancing threat. Catherine would continue her normal routines, but she would feed Marcus carefully crafted false information. Meanwhile, Thomas would work to document Marcus's treachery and build evidence of the Queen Consort's illegal seizure of noble properties. It was a game that required perfect timing and flawless execution, because discovery meant not just failure, but likely death. The first test came sooner than expected. 3 days after their conversation, Marcus approached Catherine with news that made Thomas's blood freeze. "My lady," the secretary said with his usual respectful demeanor, "I've received word that Mr. Harrison wishes to schedule another meeting with you. He says there have been new developments regarding your family's property rights." Thomas, who was arranging books on nearby shelves, watched Catherine's face carefully. She maintained perfect composure, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. They both knew that any meeting with Mr. Bull, Harrison would be immediately reported to the Queen Consort's agents, giving them more evidence to use against her. "What sort of developments?" Catherine asked, her voice calm and curious. Marcus consulted his notes. He mentioned something about discovering irregularities in recent property transfers that might affect your family's holdings. He seemed quite excited about the implications. This was exactly the kind of information that would convince the Queen Consort's agents that Catherine was actively working to undermine royal property acquisitions. Thomas realized they were looking at their first opportunity to test their strategy of feeding false information to Marcus. "How interesting," Catherine mused. "Please send word to Mr. Harrison that I'll meet with him next Thursday afternoon. But Marcus, I want to be very careful about this. Given the sensitive nature of property law, I think it would be wise to have our conversation in the garden pavilion rather than in my study. Fresh air helps me think more clearly about complex legal matters." Thomas had to admire Catherine's quick thinking. The garden pavilion was visible from multiple palace windows, making it an obviously public location. Anyone reporting on this meeting would have to admit that Catherine had chosen the most transparent possible setting. Hardly the behavior of someone engaged in treasonous plotting. Marcus made careful notes. "Shall I prepare any specific documents for your review before the meeting?" "No," Catherine replied smoothly. "I want to hear what he has to say first. If his discoveries are as significant as he claims, I'll want to research them thoroughly before making any decisions." After Marcus left, Thomas waited several minutes before approaching Catherine. "Brilliant choice about the pavilion," he said quietly. "But we need to be prepared for the possibility that they might try to listen to your conversation from a distance." "I've thought of that," Catherine said. "Mr. Harrison is a good man, but he doesn't understand the danger we're in. When I meet with him, I need to warn him that our correspondence is being monitored and that he needs to be extremely careful about how he communicates with me." Thomas nodded. "And we need to use this meeting to begin feeding them false information about your intentions." Over the next few days, Thomas carefully observed Marcus's routine, tracking his movements and contacts. What he discovered confirmed their worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy against Catherine. Marcus wasn't just reporting to one contact. He was part of a network that included 2 other palace servants, a clerk in the royal legal office, and at least one person outside the palace who seemed to coordinate the information gathering. The network was feeding information not just about Catherine, but about several other nobles who might have legitimate claims to properties the Queen Consort's family wanted to acquire. Catherine wasn't their only target. She was part of a systematic campaign to eliminate potential legal challenges to their land seizures. Thomas shared this discovery with Catherine during one of their carefully orchestrated private conversations. "They're not just going after your family's estate," he explained. "This is bigger than we thought. They're trying to eliminate anyone who might have the legal knowledge and resources to challenge their property acquisitions." Catherine absorbed this information with grim understanding. "Which means they see me as particularly dangerous because of my legal research and my connections to Mr. Pereza. Harrison." "Exactly. And it means we need to think beyond just protecting yourself. There are other innocent people being targeted by this same network." Catherine was quiet for a moment, then looked at Thomas with determination in her eyes. "Then we don't just need to expose Marcus. We need to expose the entire conspiracy." The meeting with Mr. Bliss, Harrison, took place as scheduled in the garden pavilion on a crisp Thursday afternoon. Thomas positioned himself where he could observe both the meeting and anyone who might be watching it. What he saw made him realize how sophisticated their enemy's surveillance had become. Marcus was positioned at a window where he had a clear view of the pavilion, but couldn't hear the conversation. A gardener Thomas didn't recognize was working unusually close to the pavilion, clearly trying to overhear what was being said, and a palace guard was making rounds that brought him near the pavilion far more frequently than normal security required. Catherine and Mr. Harrison spoke for nearly an hour. To anyone watching, it appeared to be a serious legal consultation. Catherine took notes, asked questions, and seemed deeply engaged with whatever Mr. Tachia did. Harrison was telling her. But Thomas knew that she was actually warning the lawyer about the surveillance and beginning to implement their plan to feed false information to their watchers. That evening, Marcus approached Catherine with apparent concern. "My lady, I couldn't help but notice that you're meeting with Mr. Kamau." Harrison seemed quite intense. "I hope the news about your family's property wasn't troubling." Catherine sighed dramatically. "I'm afraid it's more complicated than I hoped, Marcus. Mr. Harrison has discovered some irregularities in property records, but he believes we might be able to resolve them quietly through direct negotiation rather than formal legal proceedings." Thomas, who was present to serve tea, watched Marcus's eyes sharpen with interest. This was exactly the kind of information that would be immediately reported to the Queen Consort's agents, Catherine appearing to pursue private negotiations that might undermine official property acquisitions. Direct negotiation? Marcus asked. That sounds like it might be delicate to arrange. Very delicate, Catherine agreed. Mr. Harrison thinks it would be best if I could have an informal conversation with someone who has influence over property decisions. He's suggested that I might approach Lord Hamilton about arranging a private meeting with his cousin. Marcus worked to keep his expression neutral, but Thomas could see the excitement in his eyes. The idea that Catherine might try to negotiate directly with the Queen Consort about property disputes would be seen as either incredibly naive or dangerously bold. Either way, it would give their enemies ammunition to use against her. When would you hope to arrange such a meeting? Marcus asked. Mr. Fauci, Harrison thinks I should wait until after the Harvest Festival next month. That would give me time to prepare my arguments and might find the Queen Consort in a more charitable mood. This timeline would give their enemies weeks to plan how to use Catherine's apparent naivety against her. It would also give Thomas and Catherine weeks to prepare their real strategy. After Marcus left, Thomas and Catherine reviewed how the conversation had gone. He took the bait. But now we have to be prepared for them to act on this false information. They'll probably try to arrange for you to walk into some kind of trap, Thomas agreed. A meeting where your words can be misinterpreted, or where you'll be encouraged to say something that can be used as evidence against you. Over the following weeks, Thomas expanded his network of palace informants, carefully recruiting servants who had their own reasons to distrust the Queen Consort's methods. He found allies among maids who had been treated cruelly, guards who had been passed over for promotion despite loyal service, and kitchen staff who had seen nobles' families destroyed by false accusations. These allies helped him trace the flow of information from Marcus through the spy network to the Queen Consort's agents. More importantly, they helped him document the conspiracy by observing meetings, overhearing conversations, and noting which servants suddenly acquired new possessions that suggested they were being paid for information. The evidence Thomas gathered painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond targeting Catherine. The Queen Consort's agents were manipulating legal proceedings, bribing court officials, and fabricating evidence to justify property seizures. They had destroyed at least 6 noble families over the past 2 years, always using methods that appeared legal but were based on manufactured evidence and corrupted testimony. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to feed false information through Marcus while secretly working on her real defense. She used her access to the palace library to research legal precedents that could be used to challenge the Queen Consort's property acquisitions. She also began carefully documenting her own activities, creating a detailed record that would make it difficult for anyone to claim she had been engaged in treasonous plotting. The breakthrough came when one of Thomas's allies, a maid who cleaned the Queen Consort's private chambers, discovered a collection of documents that outlined the entire conspiracy. Hidden in a locked drawer were detailed reports on multiple noble families, including plans for acquiring their properties and strategies for eliminating anyone who might resist. Catherine's file was the thickest of all. It contained copies of her correspondence with her brother and Mr. Harrison, detailed reports on her daily activities, and a timeline for building a treason case against her. Most damning of all, it contained a list of witnesses who would testify against her, witnesses who had been bribed, threatened, or blackmailed into cooperation. They're planning to move against you in 3 weeks, Thomas told Catherine after reviewing the stolen documents. During the Harvest Festival, when the court is distracted by celebrations, they believe they can arrest you quietly and have you tried before anyone realizes what's happening. Catherine studied the documents with growing anger. Look at this, she said, pointing to a particular section. They're not just planning to take our family's estate, they're planning to charge my brother Edward as a co-conspirator and seize all our properties as treasonous holdings. Thomas felt a cold fury as he read the plans for destroying Catherine's entire family. We can't let this happen. We won't, Catherine said with steel in her voice. We have 3 weeks to expose this conspiracy before they can implement it, and now we have the evidence to prove everything. But even as they made plans to reveal the truth, Both Thomas and Catherine knew they were entering the most dangerous phase of their struggle. The Queen Consort's agents wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened to expose their conspiracy. And once Catherine revealed that she knew about the plot against her, there would be no going back. The next 3 weeks would determine whether justice could triumph over corruption, whether truth could defeat lies, and whether two people with nothing but courage and determination could stand against the most powerful woman in the kingdom. Thomas looked at Catherine and saw the same resolve in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. They had come too far to turn back now. The final battle for Catherine's life, her family's honor, and the rights of all the innocent people being destroyed by this conspiracy was about to begin. And Thomas knew that whatever the cost, he would stand with Catherine until the very end. The stolen documents revealed a conspiracy so extensive and ruthless that Thomas initially struggled to believe what he was reading. But as he and Catherine studied the evidence through several sleepless nights, the full scope of the Queen Consort's operation became clear. This wasn't just about acquiring valuable properties. It was about systematically destroying any noble family that might pose a future challenge to her power. Catherine's case file contained details that made Thomas's hands shake with anger. The Queen Consort's agents had been planning her destruction for over a year, carefully gathering information about her family's background, legal interests, and personal relationships. They had identified her intelligence and legal knowledge as threats that needed to be eliminated, regardless of whether she had actually done anything wrong. "Look at this timeline," Catherine said, pointing to a document that outlined their strategy. "They began targeting me even before I started meeting with Mr. Scenario. Harrison. My crime wasn't seeking legal advice. It was being smart enough to potentially seek legal advice in the future." Thomas studied the dates and felt sick. They decided you were dangerous because you asked intelligent questions about estate management during court social events. They saw your interest in law as evidence of treasonous intent. But the most chilling discovery was a list of obstacles to be removed that included not just Catherine and her brother, but Mr. Harrison, 2 other lawyers who specialized in property law, and several minor nobles whose only crime was having legitimate claims to lands the Queen Consort wanted. The conspiracy wasn't just about individual cases. It was about eliminating anyone who might interfere with a massive transfer of wealth and power. "We need allies," Catherine said after they had absorbed the full scope of what they were facing. "We can't fight this alone, and we can't trust that simply revealing the truth will be enough. The Queen Consort has too much power to be brought down by evidence alone." Thomas had been thinking the same thing. The question is who we can trust. Most of the major nobles are either connected to the Queen Consort or too frightened to oppose her openly. "But there are exceptions," Catherine mused. "Lord Pemberton lost his nephew's estate to one of these fraudulent seizures last year. Lady Ashford has been asking uncomfortable questions about the legal basis for recent property transfers. And there's Archbishop Manning, who preached about justice and corruption just last month." They decided to approach their potential allies carefully, using intermediaries and coded communications to avoid alerting the spy network. Thomas would reach out to servants in other households to gauge their master's attitudes toward the Queen Consort's property acquisitions. Catherine would use her social connections to have seemingly casual conversations about legal and moral concerns. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the head housekeeper in Lord Pemberton's household, approached Thomas during a gathering of palace staff. She was known for her discretion and loyalty, qualities that had kept her employed in noble households for over 30 years. "Thomas," she said quietly, drawing him aside from the other servants, "there are whispers that you've been asking questions about certain legal matters affecting noble families." Thomas felt his heart rate increase, wondering if their careful inquiries had been detected by the wrong people. "I wouldn't know about such things, Mrs. Hartwell." "Of course you wouldn't," she replied with a meaningful look. "But if someone were investigating irregularities in property seizures, they might be interested to know that Lord Pemberton has been quietly gathering information about his nephew's case, and they might want to know that he's discovered some very interesting connections between recent seizures and certain royal relatives." This was the opening Thomas had hoped for. If such a person existed, how might they communicate with Lord Pemberton safely? Mrs. Hartwell smiled grimly. "Through the usual channels, a servant requesting consultation about household legal matters. perfectly normal and unremarkable. The meeting with Lord Pemberton was arranged for the following week. Thomas accompanied Catherine to Pemberton's estate, ostensibly to deliver documents related to a charitable foundation they both supported. In reality, they were carrying copies of the evidence they had gathered about the conspiracy. Lord Pemberton was a man in his 60s who had earned respect through decades of fair dealing and genuine concern for justice. The loss of his nephew's estate had awakened him to the corruption spreading through the royal court, and he had been conducting his own careful investigation. "Lady Catherine," he said after they had settled in his private study, "I understand you may have information relevant to certain property disputes that have been troubling several noble families." Catherine presented their evidence systematically, explaining how they had discovered Marcus Fletcher's betrayal and the documents that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Lord Pemberton listened with growing amazement and anger, occasionally asking pointed questions that showed his own deep understanding of the situation. "This is worse than I suspected," he finally said. "My nephew's case was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. But this evidence, if we can verify its authenticity and present it properly, it could bring down the entire network." "Can it be verified?" Thomas asked. "Some of it, yes. I recognize several of the signatures on these forged documents. I know the clerks who supposedly witnessed some of these legal proceedings, and I have contacts in the Royal Legal Office who could confirm whether certain cases were handled according to proper procedures. But Lord Pemberton also warned them about the dangers they faced. The Queen Consort won't simply surrender when confronted with evidence of her crimes. She has too much power and too much at stake. If she realizes that her conspiracy has been exposed, she'll try to destroy everyone involved before they can act against her." They agreed on a strategy that would require perfect coordination and timing. Lord Pemberton would quietly approach other nobles who had been affected by suspicious property seizures, building a coalition of people with personal stakes in exposing the conspiracy. Catherine would continue her deception with Marcus Fletcher while secretly preparing a complete legal case that could be presented to the king. Thomas would coordinate communications between their allies while gathering additional evidence from palace servants. The plan required them to work quickly but carefully, building an unstoppable case before the Queen Consort realized what was happening. They had less than 2 weeks before the Queen Consort planned to move against Catherine, which meant they had to expose her conspiracy before she could implement it. The next phase of their operation revealed both the extent of their enemy's reach and the growing strength of their alliance. Lord Pemberton's inquiries confirmed that at least 12 noble families had lost properties through fraudulent legal proceedings over the past 3 years. The stolen wealth was flowing not just to the Queen Consort's relatives, but to a network of allies who supported her political ambitions. Meanwhile, Catherine's continued deception of Marcus Fletcher was providing valuable intelligence about the conspiracy's timeline and methods. Marcus had become increasingly excited about the information he was reporting, convinced that Catherine was walking into a trap that would result in her complete destruction. His confidence made him careless, and he began sharing more details about the planned accusations against Catherine. "They're planning to charge you with conspiracy to defraud the crown," Catherine reported to Thomas after a particularly revealing conversation with Marcus. "They claim you've been plotting to use false legal arguments to steal royal properties." "What's their evidence?" Thomas asked. "Mostly my correspondence with my brother and Mr. Harrison, but they're planning to bring witnesses who will testify that I made treasonous statements about the Queen Consort's right to acquire noble properties." Thomas felt cold anger as he realized how completely they had corrupted the legal process. Witnesses who were bribed or threatened? Almost certainly. But Marcus seemed particularly pleased about one witness, someone he called reliable, who would testify that I had spoken openly about challenging royal authority. This information was crucial for their defense, but it also revealed how sophisticated their enemy's approach had become. The Queen Consort's agents weren't just gathering evidence. They were manufacturing it, creating a false narrative that would justify Catherine's destruction while appearing to follow legal procedures. The breakthrough that changed everything came from Thomas's network of palace servants. Mary Preston, a kitchen maid who had been secretly observing meetings in the Queen Consort's private dining room, brought news that made their blood freeze. "They're moving faster than planned," Mary whispered to Thomas during a brief encounter in the palace corridors. I heard the Queen Consort tell her advisors that they need to resolve the Catherine problem before Lord Pemberton's inquiries attract unwanted attention. Thomas realized that their enemies had detected Lord Pemberton's investigation, even though he had been extraordinarily careful.
How much time do we have? Days, not weeks. I heard them mention that the arrest should happen during the king's hunting expedition this weekend.
With His Majesty away from the palace, they can act without interference. This news forced them to accelerate their own timeline dramatically. Instead of having 2 weeks to build their case, they had perhaps 4 days to expose the conspiracy before Catherine was arrested and likely killed. Thomas immediately sent word to Catherine and Lord Pemberton, warning them that they had to act immediately. The final preparation took place in Lord Pemberton's estate that evening, with Catherine, Thomas, and several other nobles who had quietly joined their cause. The group included Lady Ashford, whose legal knowledge rivaled Catherine's, and Sir Robert Manning, whose brother was the Archbishop. "We have one chance to present our case before they can silence us," Lord Pemberton explained to the assembled group. "Archbishop Manning has agreed to hear our evidence and, if convinced of its validity, present it directly to the king upon his return." "What about the Queen Consort's agents?" Catherine asked. "Once we reveal what we know, they'll try to stop us by any means necessary." "We've considered that," Sir Robert replied. "Several of us will remain at the Archbishop's residence until this matter is resolved. The Church offers sanctuary that even the Queen Consort cannot violate without risking a political crisis. The plan was risky, but it was their only option." The next morning, Catherine would appear to follow her normal routine while secretly gathering the evidence they would present to the Archbishop. Thomas would coordinate with palace servants to document any suspicious activities by the Queen Consort's agents, and Lord Pemberton would ensure that the Archbishop was prepared to hear their case. But as they finalized their strategy, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. The Queen Consort had survived and thrived in royal politics for years by anticipating her enemies' moves. It seemed unlikely that she would be completely unprepared for the possibility that her conspiracy might be discovered. "What if this is what she expects us to do?" he asked the group. "What if she's prepared for us to present evidence to the Archbishop?" The question silenced the room as everyone considered the implications. If the Queen Consort had anticipated their strategy, she might have prepared countermeasures that would turn their own evidence against them. "Then we make sure our case is so strong that no countermeasures can defeat it," Catherine said with determination. "And we trust that truth and justice are more powerful than lies and corruption." Looking around the room at the faces of people who had risked everything to fight for what was right, Thomas felt a surge of hope despite the overwhelming odds they faced. Tomorrow would bring the final confrontation between their small alliance and one of the most powerful women in the kingdom. The battle for Catherine's life and the integrity of the legal system was about to begin, and Thomas knew that whatever happened, they had already won something important simply by refusing to surrender to evil. The question now was whether that moral victory could be transformed into a practical one that would save Catherine and bring justice to all the innocent people who had been destroyed by the Queen Consort's greed. Dawn broke gray and cold over the palace as Thomas prepared for what he knew might be his final day as a free man. Catherine had left before sunrise, supposedly to visit the market with her maid, but actually to deliver the crucial evidence to Archbishop Manning. By evening, either their conspiracy would be exposed, or they would all be arrested for treason against the Queen Consort. Thomas went about his morning duties with forced normalcy, serving breakfast in the Great Hall and attending to his usual responsibilities. But every conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance from another servant felt like potential betrayal, and every moment brought them closer to the crisis that would determine their fate. The first sign that something was wrong came at mid-morning when Marcus Fletcher approached Thomas with unusual urgency. "Have you seen Lady Catherine this morning?" he asked, barely concealing his agitation. "She was supposed to review some correspondence with me, but she seems to have left the palace without notice." Thomas maintained his composure while his mind raced. "I believe she mentioned visiting the shops in town, sir. Perhaps she was delayed by the morning crowds." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "She left without telling me her plans, and her maid returned an hour ago, claiming that Lady Catherine had decided to visit friends and dismissed her for the day. The fact that Marcus was openly questioning Catherine's whereabouts meant that the Queen Consort's network had realized something was amiss. Thomas knew that within hours, possibly minutes, they would discover that Catherine had gone to see the Archbishop. "I'm sure she'll return soon," Thomas said carefully. "Perhaps she simply wanted some time to think about the legal matters that have been troubling her." But Marcus was already moving away, clearly intending to report Catherine's absence to his contacts. Thomas realized that their carefully planned timeline had just collapsed. Instead of having until evening to present their case, they now had perhaps an hour before the Queen Consort's agents took action to prevent the truth from reaching the king. Thomas quickly found Mary Preston in the kitchen and gave her a coded message to pass to their other allies in the palace. Within minutes, a network of servants was quietly observing and reporting on the movements of everyone connected to the Queen Consort's conspiracy. What they discovered confirmed Thomas's worst fears. Marcus Fletcher had immediately left the palace after their conversation. 2 of the Queen Consort's guards had been dispatched on urgent business to locations unknown, and most ominously, a legal clerk who was part of the conspiracy had arrived at the palace carrying official-looking documents, suggesting that arrest warrants or similar papers were being prepared. Thomas knew he had to warn Catherine, but he also knew that leaving the palace himself might trigger immediate action against all their allies. Instead, he sent word through Mrs. Hartwell, who had connections with servants in noble households throughout the city. The message was simple. "The storm is coming early. Seek shelter now." Meanwhile, at the Archbishop's residence, Catherine was presenting their evidence to a man who held the moral authority to challenge even the Queen Consort's power. Archbishop Manning was known for his integrity and courage, qualities that had sometimes put him at odds with royal policies but had earned him the respect of both nobles and common people. "These documents," the Archbishop said, studying the evidence Catherine had provided, "if authentic, reveal corruption that strikes at the very heart of our legal system." "Your Grace," Catherine replied, "Lord Pemberton has verified the signatures and dates on many of these papers. The witnesses listed on these legal proceedings have confirmed that they never testified as claimed, and the property transfers described here violate established law in multiple ways." The Archbishop continued reading, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "The systematic nature of this conspiracy is what convinces me of its authenticity. No one would fabricate such extensive documentation unless they were trying to expose a real pattern of criminal behavior." "What can be done?" Catherine asked. "The Queen Consort has too much influence for ordinary legal proceedings to touch her." "The king has ultimate authority over legal matters," Archbishop Manning replied. "If presented with irrefutable evidence of systematic corruption, even he cannot ignore it without damaging the integrity of the entire system of royal justice." But even as they spoke, the Archbishop's steward entered the room with urgent news. "Your Grace, there are royal guards approaching the residence. They appear to be carrying official documents." Catherine felt her heart sink. "They've discovered our plan." The Archbishop moved with surprising speed for a man of his years. "Lady Catherine, you will remain here under sanctuary while I deal with these guards. They cannot arrest you on church property without my permission, which they will not receive." The confrontation at the Archbishop's door was tense but civil. The Queen Consort's guards, led by Captain Morrison, presented arrest warrants for Catherine on charges of conspiracy against the crown and fraudulent claims against royal property. "These charges are serious," Archbishop Manning acknowledged as he reviewed the documents. "But they are also conveniently timed. I find it remarkable that Lady Catherine would be accused of conspiracy on the very day she has brought me evidence of actual conspiracy against multiple noble families." Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Your Grace, my orders are to arrest Lady Catherine and return her to the palace for questioning." "Your orders," the Archbishop replied firmly, "do not override the ancient right of sanctuary. Lady Catherine will remain here until these matters can be properly investigated by His Majesty upon his return." The standoff lasted for several hours, with the guards maintaining their positions outside the Archbishop's residence while refusing to violate church sanctuary. But as afternoon faded toward evening, Thomas's worst fears were realized when additional guards arrived with new orders. A messenger bearing the Queen Consort's seal presented Archbishop Manning with a royal decree temporarily suspending the right of sanctuary in cases of treason against the crown. The decree was technically legal, though it represented an unprecedented attack on church authority. "Your Grace," Captain Morrison said with obvious reluctance, "I must now insist that you surrender Lady Catherine for questioning." The Archbishop studied the decree carefully, then looked at Captain Morrison with steel in his eyes. "Captain, this decree may be technically legal, but it is morally bankrupt. I will not surrender an innocent woman to a corrupt system. Then I'm afraid we must enter your residence by force." "You may try," Archbishop Manning replied, "but I warn you that violating church sanctuary without just cause will have consequences that extend far beyond today's events." As tension mounted outside the Archbishop's residence, Thomas was orchestrating a desperate gambit back at the palace. With Catherine trapped and unable to return, their only hope was to present their evidence to someone else who could ensure it reached the king. Thomas had discovered that Sir William Blackwood, the king's personal secretary, had returned early from the hunting expedition to handle urgent correspondence. Sir William was known for his absolute loyalty to the king and his careful attention to matters that might affect royal authority. The challenge was getting the evidence to Sir William without alerting the Queen Consort's network. Thomas recruited 4 trusted servants to create a distraction by staging a minor emergency in the palace kitchens while he slipped the documents under Sir William's door, along with a note explaining their significance. The note was brief, but clear. "Sir William, the enclosed documents reveal a conspiracy to defraud noble families of their properties through false legal proceedings. Lady Catherine and others who have investigated this corruption are being falsely accused of treason to silence them. His Majesty needs to see this evidence before irreversible injustices are committed in his name." As evening approached, the various threads of the crisis began to converge. The Queen Consort had returned to the palace and was furiously demanding updates on Catherine's arrest. Marcus Fletcher was providing detailed reports about Catherine's recent activities and her connections to other nobles who had been asking uncomfortable questions. And somewhere in the palace, Sir William was reading evidence that could destroy the entire conspiracy. The climax came when Sir William emerged from his chambers and requested an immediate audience with the Queen Consort. Thomas, positioned where he could observe the corridor outside the royal apartments, watched as 2 of the most powerful people in the kingdom faced each other in a confrontation that would determine the fate of everyone involved in their struggle. The meeting lasted over an hour, with raised voices occasionally audible through the thick doors. When Sir William finally emerged, his expression was grim but determined. He immediately dispatched riders with urgent messages to the king and sent guards to escort the Archbishop and Catherine safely back to the palace under royal protection. The Queen Consort's reaction was swift and desperate. Within minutes, she had issued orders for the arrest of Lord Pemberton, Sir Robert Manning, and several other nobles who had supported the investigation. But Sir William had anticipated this response and had already placed those individuals under royal protection as material witnesses in a case of potential treason against the crown. By midnight, the palace was in chaos. The Queen Consort's conspiracy had been exposed, but she was fighting back with all the resources at her disposal. Servants loyal to her were destroying documents. Witnesses were being threatened or bribed to change their testimony, and accusations were flying in all directions. Thomas found himself at the center of the storm when Marcus Fletcher, realizing that his own position was now untenable, attempted to claim that he had been secretly gathering evidence of Catherine's treachery on behalf of royal security. The accusation would have been laughable if not for the serious danger it represented to Thomas and everyone who had helped expose the conspiracy. But the evidence was too strong and too comprehensive to be dismissed or discredited. Sir William had spent the evening verifying key details with his own sources, and the pattern of corruption was undeniable. When additional documents were found in the Queen Consort's private chambers that corroborated the stolen evidence, even her most loyal supporters began to distance themselves from her cause. The king returned to the palace the following morning to find his court in upheaval, and his wife accused of orchestrating a massive conspiracy to defraud noble families of their properties. The evidence presented to him was so extensive and detailed that he had no choice but to order a full investigation under his personal supervision. The trials that followed revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and resulted in the restoration of properties to wrongfully dispossessed families. The Queen Consort was stripped of her titles and exiled to a remote estate where she could no longer influence court politics. Marcus Fletcher and several other conspirators were imprisoned for their roles in the fraud. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the reform of legal procedures governing property disputes, changes that made it much more difficult for powerful individuals to manipulate the system for their own benefit. Thomas was rewarded for his courage with a position as estate manager for one of the restored properties, giving him financial security and social status he had never imagined possible. But the real reward, he knew, was seeing Catherine safely restored to her family and knowing that their struggle had protected other innocent people from similar persecution. Catherine herself became an advocate for legal reform, using her knowledge and experience to help other families navigate property disputes fairly and transparently. She never forgot that her salvation had come not from her own intelligence or social position, but from the willingness of a servant to risk everything for what was right. Years later, when people asked Thomas why he had risked his life to help Catherine, his answer was always the same. She treated me like a human being when others saw me as furniture. When the time came to return that kindness, I couldn't do anything else and still call myself a man. The story became a legend in the palace, told quietly among servants as an example of how courage and integrity could triumph over corruption and power. But for Thomas, it was simply the memory of the day he discovered that doing the right thing, regardless of the consequences, was the only way to live with honor, in a world that often rewarded those who abandoned their principles for personal gain. In the end, the conspiracy failed not because its enemies were more powerful, but because they were more determined to preserve their humanity than to protect their safety. It was a lesson that echoed through the halls of power long after the principal players had moved on to other chapters of their lives. A reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are won not by those with the most resources, but by those with the strongest commitment to truth and justice.